guys, happy Monday. So last week you were learning about the New England colonies, and we first learned about the New England colonies a few weeks ago when you were learning about pilgrims who were also called separatists. So just a little recap of that. So you remember that the separatists wanted to separate from the Church of England. They were not happy with the things that were going on with the Church of England, so they wanted to separate. And back then it was illegal to not go to the Church of England. So they decided to first go to Holland. It didn't work out in Holland. So they decided that they would come into the New World, where Jamestown by 1620 had already become very successful. Unfortunately, their ship got blown off course and they ended up in what is today Massachusetts. The Pilgrims arrived here and they got along with the Native Americans, which then ended up allowing them to have a successful colony. Once Massachusetts became successful, more people wanted to move into that area. People called Puritans, who they didn't want to separate from the church, they just wanted to purify the church, decided that they would also move into Massachusetts. Well, when the Puritans arrived, they made every other person who came to Massachusetts sign what is called a covenant. And remember that the covenant was a law, or it was a set of rules that would make people follow those rules. And if you didn't, then you would have to leave the colony. So Massachusetts had a lot of Puritans and separatists who moved over into this area. They colonized that area. And so they actually had both of these areas right here. But Massachusetts did not allow for religious freedom. You had to agree with what they came up with. So if people disagreed, then they would be forced to move. And that is how Rhode Island and Connecticut were established. Rhode Island and Connecticut they allowed religious freedom. Then we moved on to the middle colonies on Friday. And in the middle colonies, they were a very diverse population. They had people from all over Europe who spoke different languages. They had all different religions. Not only did they have the Catholics and the Protestants, but they also allowed for Quakers to move over into the New World. They were very tolerant of all races. They had a wide variety and it worked for them. It was a very successful, all of these colonies grew very quickly because more and more people wanted to move over and actually have religious freedom. They wanted to be tolerated. So today we're going to move on to the southern colonies. This time we are not going to use our textbook. I actually have something that's a little bit shorter that we will do, and so you'll just need to follow along on the Google Slides with me. Okay. So the southern colonies are going to be Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, which are all right here. They're the southern colonies. The southern colonies are one of the three groups that made up the original 13 colonies. The southern colonies include Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Like the New England colonies and the middle colonies, the southern colonies have their own character. The character of the southern colonies developed from its people, its geography, and its climate. The founders of the southern colonies came to America seeking wealth in the form of land ownership. Some were rich aristocrats from England who became owners of huge tracts of land in America. Some were owners of large businesses such as the Virginia Company, which founded Jamestown. These landowners recognized that the southern colonies were rich in farmland. The coastal plains and the rolling hills were perfect for raising crops. The rich soil and the warm weather helped the crops thrive. They established very large farms known as plantations. Each plantation required many, many workers. Growing the crops was nearly a year-round job in the warmer colonies, and there were lots of other jobs to do on a large plantation. Okay. I want you guys to take a moment to look at the different pictures of the different plantations on the next slides. How is a plantation similar to a village? Okay. As you can see, a plantation has basically everything that you would need in order to survive. People who lived on a plantation would have vegetable gardens, they would have their own carpenters, they would have their own blacksmiths, they would have, of course, the big house, they would have their own wheat crops to be able to make their own bread. They would have a variety of different skills, any different types of, well, they just had a variety of different jobs there. And they had a bunch of people living in one area. And so that is how they are very similar to what a village is. They had everything that they would need, just like a village did. Plantation owners could not find enough workers among the European immigrants to the United States. Most of these immigrants wanted to farm their own land, not work for someone else. The Native Americans were not interested in taking jobs on the plantations either. Plantations were huge. They needed a lot of workers, and originally they were hoping that they would be able to get some indentured servants, which, remember, that indentured servants were people who would actually sign up to go and live in the New World, work in the New World for 5 to 7 years. And then after 5 to 7 years, when their debt was paid off, they would be able to go back, or they would be able to move on. And a lot of times they would be given land, they would be given some different animals. It was kind of, it was a way for them to get a leg up. They were wanting to move over into the New World, they just couldn't afford it. So at first they were trying to get indentured servants, but they couldn't get enough. Each plantation needed about 200 people to work on it in order for them to harvest the crops year round. In the South, it's warm most of the time. So they actually have jobs for the farms all year long. And so they needed a lot of people. Native Americans just weren't interested. They didn't want to work for the plantation owners. And because they knew the land, it was easier for them to actually leave. They would run away into an area called the backcountry, which is on the western side of the 13 colonies. They would just move, they would leave and move away. Or unfortunately, they were getting sick from the different diseases that the Europeans were carrying. So they turned to something else that had been around for a very long time. The plantation owners found the solution to their labor shortage on a Dutch slave ship. They purchased their first slaves in Jamestown in 1619. According to some histories, these first African Americans were known as indentured servants rather than slaves. Either way, they were forced to work on the plantations. Many more Africans followed in their footsteps as the years went on. By the 1660s, states were passing laws that made slavery legal. These laws stated that slaves were the property of their masters, just like houses and farm animals. The slave codes, as they became known, also stated that any children born to a slave woman were automatically slaves too. They stated that slaves would stay slaves for their entire lives. As terrible as slavery seems today, there was little opposition to it in the colonial times. Immigrants to America had come from a society where rich people controlled the wealth and where poor people did the work. That did not seem unusual to the American settlers. There were some things about American slavery that were unusual even then, though. The enslavement of people based solely on their race was a sad new development. So was the enslaving of people for their entire lifetime. A few people raised their voices against slavery early on, but for the most part, slavery did not meet any real opposition for many years. The plantation system would continue to operate and with rich plantation owners and slave labor for more than 200 years. So for a very long time, for thousands of years, slavery has been around. But this was the first time that it singled in on a certain race. Before this time, usually slavery was because of a war. And when one side would win, then the other side would become slaves to the winning side. But now it was based off, or not now today, but back then, 200 years ago, back in the 1600s and 1700s, they came to expect it. Kids were raised that it was okay. Adults thought that it was okay. And unfortunately, it took over 200 years to change. In fact, the plantation system would continue to grow until it became the basis for the economy of the southern colonies. Crops of tobacco, sugarcane, cotton, indigo, and other goods were exported from the plantations to England year after year. Today, descendants of the colonial slaves, plantation owners, and other people of the southern colonies live and work in the southern United States. Their lives are still affected in many ways by the system of slavery begun so many years ago by settlers who came here to profit from the rich American land. The economy in the southern colonies grew very fast. They had such great farmland, and over in Europe, people were willing to pay big bucks for different crops, such as indigo, which indigo is a type of plant that has blue dye. They also wanted cotton. They wanted tobacco. They wanted corn. They wanted all of these natural resources from America over in Europe, and people were willing to pay big bucks in Europe. So plantations started popping up left and right, and that really helped the southern colonies' economy grow. Okay. Go ahead, and I want you to read all 8 questions that are on the next slide in the Google Forms. Make sure that you are